At first glance, in our English translations of the biblical text, we find scant references to drugs. Google what the Bible says about drugs, and you will find websites pointing to some basic biblical warnings about not getting too drunk from wine. Taken at face value, these would suggest that the Bible has more warnings about wine than it does about ayahuasca or peyote. Perhaps the Rastafarians are right, and Christians should sit around smoking ganja in a worshipful way rather than drinking beer at the church picnic. Given this truth, why do most people think it is so unchristian to sit around having ecstatic visions on ayahuasca? The answer is that there is something giant missing from the English translations of the Bible. The New Testament was written in an ancient form of Greek called Koine Greek, and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. But in the first century world of Jesus and his apostles, there was a widely used Koine Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. When the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it is more often than not the Septuagint that is quoted. So Koine Greek is both the language of the New Testament and the language of the Old Testament Bible that Jesus and his apostles would have read. And what is the word for drugs in Koine Greek? It is pharmakia. If the word pharmakia sounds familiar, it is probably because pharmakia is where we get our English word pharmacy. And this word, in its various forms, is found multiple times in the New Testament and throughout the Koine Greek translation of the Old Testament. The reason it is not translated simply as drugs is that the word has another rendering, often used by scholars. Because of the context, in most biblical instances, scholars translate the various conjugations of pharmakia as one of the following: witch, wizard, witchcraft, sorcerer, sorcery, divination. Yes, the word for witchcraft and the word for drugs are the same in the language of the Bible. The Freiburg lexicon defines pharmakia as, quote, one who prepares and uses drugs for magical purposes or ritual witchcraft, sorcerer, poisoner, magician. The Louw-Nida lexicon defines it as, quote, the use of drugs for any kind of magical effect, sorcery, magic, end quote. The Liddell Scott lexicon defines it as, quote, the use of drugs, potions, spells, end quote. As is clear from these definitions, this is not a case where the same word has two different meanings, such as the English word bark, that can mean either the sound a dog makes or the outer layer of a tree. No, this is a case where the two translations come out of a single common aspect of sorcery and witchcraft in the ancient world. More often than not, when shamans, witch doctors, prophetesses, mediums, and sorcerers did their work in the ancient world, a brew of some sort of hallucinogenic form was employed. And the two practices became so associated in the minds of the ancient Greek world that they shared a single word, pharmakia. As Leslie Wilson notes, quote, the very uncertainty of the exact lines of demarcation, if any exist, of the boundaries between religion, magic, and medicine has rendered the theoretical distinctions between them untenable in practice, end quote. So when the Jews who translated the Hebrew of the Old Testament into Greek to create the Septuagint, and the Jewish apostles who wrote the New Testament used the word pharmakia, they were strongly associating pagan and shamanic rituals and drugs. With this in mind, let's review some of what the Bible says. Old Testament references will be from the Koine Greek of the Septuagint. Let's start with Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. The English translation is, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. The word sorceress is pharmakaos, a conjugation of pharmakia in Koine Greek. The translation using the Freiburg lexicon would be rendered something like this: do not allow one who prepares drugs for spiritual purposes to live. And suddenly, what the Bible says about drugs becomes much clearer. The Bible is saying that the mixing of drugs and religion is so bad that the Israelites should not even let someone live who does it. Let's consider the Greek Septuagint's rendering of Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10. Quote, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his daughter or son in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in pharmakos." Notice the statement about human sacrifice. The Bible has several links between human sacrifice, widely practiced by ancient religions that did use drugs as part of their worship, as we saw in the previous chapter, and pharmakia. Now, consider 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 6, a verse talking about the evil king Manasseh. Quote, "He sacrificed his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, practiced sorcery, divination, and witchcraft, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger." End quote. This conjugation of pharmakia is rendered thus by the Liddell Scott lexicon. Quote, 1, to administer a drug, or 2, to use enchantments. End quote. So King Manasseh became so evil that he sacrificed his children in the fire and started administering drugs with the implication of spiritual or ritual usage. Consider 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 22. When Joram saw Jehu, he asked, "Have you come in peace, Jehu?" "How can there be peace?" Jehu replied, "as long as all the idolatry and pharmaca of your mother Jezebel abound." End quote. Jezebel is the notoriously evil queen in the Bible. When Jehu lists her two greatest evils, he says idolatry and pharmaca. Jewish people, such as Christ's earliest followers, St. Peter and St. Paul, would have grown up reading one of the two most evil actions of one of the wickedest people in the Bible, included using drugs for spiritual purposes. Nahum chapter 3, verse 4 records the prophet stating that the city of Nineveh enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her pharmaca. Many other references of the Old Testament carry on this theme. In Exodus chapter 9, the men who prevent Egypt from listening to the warnings of Moses, ultimately bringing on the plagues, were sorcerers, pharmakos. And in Micah chapter 5, verse 12, God promises that when he acts, he will act to destroy pharmakia. In summary, the Old Testament, as found in the Koine Greek Septuagint, states that those who practice pharmakia, the ritual, spiritual, magical use of drugs, are not worthy to live. They are the worst sorts of people who deceive whole nations and lead to human sacrifice and bloodlust. In between the closing of the Old Testament canon and the writing of the New Testament, there were a group of books now described as the Apocrypha. These books are accepted as canonical by Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but not by Protestants or Jews. Whether taken as canonical or not, the books were undeniably influential in the early church and certainly helped shape Christian thinking about the practice of pharmakia. Consider the book of Wisdom. Wisdom, chapter 12, verse 4, says that God hated the Canaanites because of two things: their wicked sacrifices, likely human, and their pharmakia. Note yet again the close association that the ancient Hebrews had between human sacrifice and pharmakia. Now let us move to the New Testament. Things do not get any rosier for those who practice pharmakia. The Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 20, lists pharmakia as one of the things that are signs of having a sinful nature, and that those that practice such things, quote, will not enter the kingdom of heaven, end quote. The book of Revelation has several condemnations of pharmakia, including Revelation chapter 9, verse 21, where a church is condemned for failing to set aside their pharmakia. One wonders if this early church hoped to learn about God in the same way modern thinkers do, using some ancient Near East version of ayahuasca. Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, and Revelation chapter 22, verse 15 list those who practice pharmakia as the people who will be cast out of the kingdom on the day of judgment. Interestingly, Revelation chapter 18, verse 23 says that all nations were deceived by the pharmakia of Babylon. This echoes Nahum chapter 3, verse 4, where Nineveh enslaved whole nations by her pharmakia. Let us stop and review the biblical teachings on pharmakia. The biblical indictment against it seems almost unhinged. Here's a summary of what the Bible says. Number one, those who practice pharmakia are not worthy of life. Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. Number two, there is a close association between pharmakia and human sacrifice. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10, 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 6, Wisdom chapter 12, verse 4. Number three, it deceives whole nations. Revelation chapter 18, verse 23, and Nahum chapter 3, verse 4. Number four, those who practice it will be cast out of God's presence. Galatians chapter 5, verse 20, and Revelation chapter 22, verse 15.